Panelists, our esteemed panelists, to Michael Shank, but I have the honor of introducing Michael. So Michael started teaching for us in the spring of 2016. This is his second semester, and he'll be joining us again in the spring. And I emphasize this because his course, Sustainable Development, has just been so extraordinarily well received. We had originally brought him on to have these types of conversations. So great thanks. And in his spare time, he is also the head of communications, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network in New York, where he handles communications for Professor Jeffrey Sachs and the SDSN's work on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And he was also formerly Director of Media Strategy at Climate Nexus, Associate Director for Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and U.S. Congressman Michael Honda's Senior Policy Advisor and Communications Director. He has his PhD from George Mason's University School for Conflict Analysis and Conflict Resolution. And just to sort of emphasize the communications, I think that's something that all of Michael's students do, and to use the analytic skills and to be able to sort of present information in a powerful, provocative way so that people will listen. So with that, I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation, and thank you all.
Great, thanks Carolyn. Oh yeah, sure. Thank you for coming. A torrential downpour outside is prohibited for many, but I appreciate you showing up. This is great. Who was here last year when we had Justin Gillis from the New York Times, and 20 people from MSNBC, NBC, and now he's with CBS. Good. And who in general is tracking the Paris process? I just want to get a sense of where we're at in the room and where we should take, oh, there's applause, so yes, thank you for tracking it and caring about it. Just get a sense of where the room is at, so where we can take this conversation. Because we can take it in many directions. We can take it in the Trump direction, we can take it in the UN, Paris, Marrakesh direction, we can take it in energy policy, all the above. It's really up to you, and I want us to serve you best, and part of that will be turning off your phone. So, because our phone came up, that's a nice... The vibration, the noise, not fully up. Mine is still on. So, before I introduce these two incredible friends, colleagues, and communicators, I just want to give a brief overview of where we're at. And I did not go to Marrakesh. My boss did. My boss is actually, you did? Oh, fun. I was at Paris, but didn't go to Marrakesh. My boss went, and several colleagues that went. And in fact, Jeff Sachs is talking tonight with Ban Ki-moon up the street, many blocks up the street, about the Sustainable Development Goals. And if I wasn't here, I'd be there. But it's more fun being here, so sorry, Jeff. If you just Google UNFCCC, Marrakesh, you come to their homepage, and I want to read a paragraph where they synopsize what they deemed as success from the recent talks, which was COP22, basically the next step after COP21.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
The conference, it's a simple sentence, the conference successfully demonstrated to the world that the implementation of the Paris Agreement is underway and the constructive spirit of multilateral cooperation on climate change continues. I read that because the bar is very low. Anyone who tracked the fallout in Copenhagen knows that just getting consensus on a general goal, Ban Ki-moon and others think is success. So what's happened in the last year since I was last on the stage with Tony and Justin? Not much, frankly, from a climate perspective. And not much will happen until maybe 2018 and maybe 2023. I reference those two dates because in 2018, the global community by then will be ready to do a stock taking of where we are at with emissions, how we're going to report on emissions reductions, how we're going to review that process, and then in 5 years, 2023, hopefully nations will come back with ramped up, more ambitious goal setting. Good news is This is the first ever consensus on climate change, so that's great. Bad news from an accountability perspective is that there's really no legal enforcement mechanism. As Janos Pastor, who was Ban Ki-moon's climate guy, said, this is naming and encouraging. Classic UN speak, it's not naming and shaming, it's naming and encouraging to get nations to commit to what they committed to through their nationally determined contributions. So all the nations came together and said, let's see, this is Michael Shank's nationally determined contribution representing the US. I'm going to count in that some of the stuff that the states are doing, some of the cities, clean power plan, let's throw in some more emissions reductions from the vehicles, etc. China comes in, here's my nationally determined contribution. And that was entirely voluntary. And the process going forward will be voluntary too, with the expectation and the obligation that it will be ramped up. Now, what Paris and Marrakesh do, which is good, is that it greenlights a whole bunch of processes at the UN to support nations as they mitigate for climate change, as they adapt to climate change, as they encourage climate finance for the poor countries who are getting screwed from extreme weather. So it does set up all these support mechanisms at the UN. That's good. But in terms of accountability, holding feet to the fire, moving now versus later, so that we actually keep this planet under 2 degrees in terms of warming from pre-industrial era temps, we're already kind of halfway there. We can't keep going, we have to start now. This is a bit of a can punting down the road because we're really not working until 2020, and then you might see some ramped up ambitions. So I say that because everything else that's not being addressed in this conversation, like citizen action, like city action, like states action, states and regions, governors, is super critical. Because what if you have a president or prime minister who comes into power and says, you know what, the previous president, I'm not speaking hypothetical, clearly.
This is a demonstration
that NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution, I don't like it so much. And I'm actually going to whittle away at that which President Obama contributed to the conversation. So you see the danger therein in a lack of legal enforcement mechanism as part of this process. Good news, we've entered into force. We needed 55 countries representing 55% of the global emissions to ratify the Paris Agreement, which they did, so early November this month still. We entered into force, so that's good language, that's accountable language. But this is really a voluntary process, and that's where we lie. So, communicators like Eric Roston and Katherine Keating are super critical in this process because if the federal governments, like the Trump administrations, don't move forward voluntarily, which, as we can see with various EPA picks and transition picks, we don't see them heading in that direction because they're often picking climate deniers or people who think climate science is bunk. Then what do we do? I'm thrilled to have them both here because they're two of my favorite people in the media space. And as we saw with the election, media disappointed me in many ways for not pressing the issues that really matter, climate being one of them. But here are two people who are really committed, who are in it for the long term and long run, and who are doing incredible things within the organizations they represent, Bloomberg and Vice Impact now, with Katherine launching that. So let me just give a brief intro to them, have them say some words on where we're headed, given the play, the state of play that we've seen, and then let's get into a conversation with questions in my mind are most interesting. So Eric Roston, sustainability editor at Bloomberg News. I've known him for several years now. He writes some of the more entertaining stuff. He's both a serious reporter and always looking for a creative hook, which I appreciate, so he's thinking outside the box. So he writes about sex and climate and a whole host of other interesting tacks, but he also has taken a serious look at the Keating curve and where carbon emissions are going and presenting incredible visuals because it's not all language. We know language doesn't move people per se. Facts and figures don't necessarily motivate the masses. So he's trying to create as many visuals, what's responsible for GHGs, etc. Check out his stuff online, it's amazing. And his most recent piece delved into Trump and energy, so I'm interested in his take on where we're going forward in 2017. And then Katherine Keating is launching Vice News' Vice Impact, which, as I've heard her state, has a goal of engaging the populace in ways that other media outlets like The Guardian and Huffington Post that have also launched socially responsible, environmentally responsible writing and media work. What she wants to do with Vice Impact is incredible. I wish her well because we desperately need it. And from what I know of her, which is a short period of time, if she's running it, it will get done, which is awesome. And so we'll hear from her as well and just jump into a Q&A. Eric.
Okay. When I look at the question again that framed tonight's talk, I was really relieved because I didn't
This
memorize
is a
it.
demonstration of Wirecast.
But it was basically, we were talking about a look ahead to 2017, post-Paris, and the amount of uncertainty, particularly in the United States right now, is so overwhelming that I can't think of the last time I was on a panel and there was less of a real-world referent that like you could point to and say, well, clearly the trend is this. I mean, in the United States, after the election, I started wondering, what are the chances
This
that Donald
is a
Trump has
demonstration
ever
of
had
Wirecast.
a briefing on climate change? And then, like a week later, the Washington Post reported that the president-elect has been waving away his intelligence briefings. So it's like, okay, well, if he's not taking intelligence briefings, there's some probability that he doesn't know, no one has sat down and walked him through this. It's possible, I don't know.
This is
And
a
it's also quite
demonstration of
possible that
Wirecast.
it's an issue that he or the administration has no interest in. And so the way Washington works is when there's an issue that you're not interested in, but somebody else really is, you just give it to them because people appreciate favors. And then when you need a favor, that's kind of how Washington works. And not, it's all hypothetical, which is, of course, the beauty of our conversation here tonight. But I'm just massively confused by the
This is a
spectrum and
demonstration of
variability
Wirecast.
of things that might happen in the next year. He might pull out of Paris on January 20th. He might not. I don't know. He doesn't know.
Is that my moment? Okay, so I actually went to COP and I actually found out that President Trump had become, elect Trump had become president by the captain of the airplane as I was landing. And I'm a nervous flyer, so there was nothing more upsetting about hearing people shriek on an airplane as we were descending into Marrakesh than that morning. And it cast a shadow over Marrakesh for sure. The U.S. delegation, there were tears on panels, and I thought that was actually an important moment for people to realize like how tentative these negotiations are, and about contributions and the effects of world leaders on these negotiations. So I guess they're voluntary, of course, and so whoever is in power should be running that mandate. But it dawned on me this afternoon as I was heading over here that there's nothing new about this kind of conversation about the US not being in support of climate change. We saw this through the Kyoto Protocol signing. We saw this when I worked on climate change policy in Australia for the government. I remember seeing Inconvenient Truth, and there were, Al Gore was shaking his finger at both the United States and Australia and China at the time for their lack of commitment towards climate change. So, we are all freaking out about Trump, but at the end of the day, in my opinion, nothing really has changed in terms of the US's kind of position on climate change policy. And again, in the context of voluntary commitments, and in the gridlock that is Washington too, what does that really mean? Of course, none of us really know, and again, it's at the beck and call of Trump. I think that a lot of electioneering has informed most of his conversations. I think most of us in this room would be shocked by the fact that he did become, that he did win the election, and no one can really fathom what consequences that's going to have on international policy. But we're already seeing him renege on many things. You're seeing him wind back these positions, but the key indicators from the onset have been slightly discouraging. I don't think we should spend too much time on that because,
This
again,
is a demonstration of
we've got 4 years of this
Wirecast.
to chat about it, and I'm still not ready to come to terms with his presidency or what's going to actually happen. So give me me a couple more weeks, but I am excited by the fact that this has been a wake-up call for everybody in the space, and it certainly has been, I think, for Vice. Like I've worked in government as a political advisor for many years, and I've worked on the international scene for the last decade, and I chose intentionally to get into media
This
because
is a
I felt like
demonstration
there was
of
a massive
Wirecast.
disconnect between the electorate, particularly millennials, who are now the defining vote basically anywhere in the world. But we've just seen it here. You know, young, white, American males decided not to vote for Hillary, they voted for Trump. And so, cracking that nut and really getting young people impassioned by these issues and understanding how that weighs really on the political process, and so
This
you have
is a
young people aren't
demonstration of
voting, they're not
Wirecast.
engaging in their politicians, and they want change, but what type of change? And there is a big disconnect there. Young people care about climate change, but it was the media's responsibility to create a connection between climate change and this election, and that wasn't even part of the process. It wasn't part of any of the formal debates. And so we have a responsibility now to inform the electorate. And I feel the media didn't do enough, and I know we certainly didn't. Vice is broken up into
This is a
many
demonstration
different
of
divisions, and we were
Wirecast.
launching an online news channel, and so we didn't really keep the pressure on during this election because we were building a whole new division of our company. The news division was building a whole new division of our company, and someone that was working there who was a very political individual, that was hugely frustrating, although we did what we could. But everyone, now that the election's over, is saying we could have done something more. And I'm the first to say I really think we should have. So, as Michael was saying, we are
This is a
launching
demonstration of
a
Wirecast.
platform of which one of the primary focuses, I should say, is climate change. And that's a really exciting opportunity for those of you that aren't avid consumers of Vice Media. We are now the largest millennial media company in the world, and we're now the fourth largest media company in the world. And so the purpose of my platform, at least, is to bring some subjective journalism into play. As you can tell, I have opinions and prepared to share them, and actually talk about
This
these
is a
issues by
demonstration
bringing
of
stakeholders to the
Wirecast.
table and talking about these issues with an agenda. And so on climate change specifically, we're not the experts on climate change, although we're corralling experts, to try and think about what our coverage is going to look like over the next couple of years. For the first time as well, Vice is kind of we produce 100% of our own content. Obviously, we interview
This is a
experts in the
demonstration
field,
of
but this is like the
Wirecast.
first opportunity to really bring stakeholders to the table and work on agenda setting. And so I've reached out to the UN Foundation, UNFCCC, UNSCN, Solutions Project, Purpose, many of these great corrallers of movements and policy in the space, to challenge everyone to say, well, how can we work together effectively to work on this issue? And so that's kind of my throw to the floor, is to say,
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
I'm in a really fortunate position to work for such an exciting young company that is able to kind of produce. And so what does that look like in terms of corral? By
Wirecast.
many organizations. So I'm very curious. That was one of the very excited being on stage. Hear from you as to what you want the role the media should be playing in this, and what type of content you want to see
Of Wirecast.
within this.
I have two quick questions. Organizations, including my boss, starting 501c3, we filed with an attorney today, focused on the SDG and Sustainable Development Goals, 501c3, because there's a lot of money out of the discontent and the frustration and the fear and the anxiety. So new organizations are cropping up. So that's
Demonstration of
2017.
Wirecast. This is a demonstration of
Take
Wirecast.
those in reverse. There's nothing more important than numbers. I think that's incontrovertible. It's numbers that got us into this to begin with, like monitoring and observing and counting. We've gotten extremely good at counting. And whatever numbers are, you mentioned the 2 degrees number, which is fuzzy. There's high precision and low precision numbers. But because this is a conversation that's based on empiricism at its heart, I try never to get too far away from numbers. And the advocacy part, you're right, it's not really my job. I mean, I'm an advocate for getting things right. And and I think we're pretty forceful sometimes in saying this is right and this is wrong. And it's just one example, I guess. I haven't done this in a couple of years,
This
but for
is
a
a
while,
demonstration
once a
of
year, I was writing
Wirecast.
a column about George Will, the columnist who, for many years has been in some degree of climate change denial. I've known that in a few years, but like that's what I, in my role of, being a, sort of old school, I guess, journalist, is like just fact checking is my use to society. And then the first
This is a
question was,
demonstration of Wirecast.
what's coming up next year, and he's just exposing corruption and incompetence and numbers.
For you?
Yeah, like my job doesn't change all that much, except that there may be different kinds of stories. I mean, I've always written about the EPA and other relevant agencies.
And you still have people who call the EPA?
This
But
is a demonstration
the
of
FOIA,
Wirecast.
works. And when people get frustrated, historically speaking, in administrations, and certainly in Congress, then the leaks start up, and Congress basically makes journalism possible because you can't FOIA Congress, and you never know who's giving who what. There's lots of reasons for people to play off of everybody else. So if anything changes in my job,
This is a demonstration
it'll
of
be,
Wirecast.
just looking for, again, these like peering down silos and seeing like, who is not reading their numbers and who is reading the numbers but isn't doing anything about it. Like to me, just about like what useful he's ever said was David Hume. But he said he sees people making arguments on every topic under the sun and says he doesn't know how people get from stating that something is to my job is just to referee boring policy discussions, or for that matter, any policy discussion.
Creative packaging. If you look at clean energy, Eric's last piece.
And it's not easy, but that was an interesting piece because
This is a
like 2 years
demonstration
ago,
of
Lockheed Martin
Wirecast.
announced in this big splashy press release campaign that they had stumbled onto a way to do nuclear fusion in a contained environment, like so small that you could put the whole reactor on the back of a truck. And well, we're 2 years into those 10 years, so I thought, all right, well, clock's ticking, guys. And then I started looking at all the fusion startups, and Peter Thiel was behind one of them. It's like a week after
This
the
is
election.
a demonstration
it's just the
of
fact that
Wirecast.
one of Trump's reportedly key advisors on energy is a few $1 million into a nuclear fusion startup. Well, that's interesting because he talks really openly about how we need to go with low carbon, and I'm going to refer you to an op-ed he had in the Times last year. year, November, about conventional nuclear. So that's interesting, right? He's like a Trump advisor talking about the importance
This
of a low
is a
carbon
demonstration
world,
of
funding,
Wirecast.
a long shot solution. All right, well, like that's how this conversation gets more interesting. It's how you go from, okay, well, Trump had a tweet in 2012 suggesting that China made up climate change to, sell us jeans or something, and but then, like, okay, well, who's he going to listen to? He's got this guy over here, and he's got these interests. He's got, like, I don't know. And we'll know within weeks, like,
This
which way the
is a
conversation
demonstration
is
of
gonna
Wirecast.
And I hear you on the gap between is and ought. I will say that Eric is not one of the reporters, and there are still many out there, particularly for broadcast, less for print and online and real news outlets, where they present the false balance. You see this all the time in terms of 50-50, science is still out. Classic story for me is CNN called me one time. It was a snow day here in New York, so we weren't working, I was sledding. And they wanted someone to pit against, a scientist to pit against Cato Institute, which is funded by the
This
Koch
is a
brothers,
demonstration
classic
of
denier,
Wirecast.
doesn't want federal involvement on climate action at all. And they wanted to present like, okay, Cato versus the scientist, 50-50, talking climate, because we're talking about potential climate change impacts on extreme weather on the East Coast with the blizzard that we had. And I could not get a scientist to go against Cato because they didn't want to participate in that false framing. And so you don't do that. And I don't, does anyone at Bloomberg do that? No. Yeah. So as you're taking in news,
This is a
and
demonstration
smart room,
of
it's not-
Wirecast.
You would be distracted by that, but we have to be super mindful about how it's being framed for us, because it is still being framed by broadcast media as the verdict is still out, which it clearly isn't. To those two questions, how do you tackle them?
I guess to go to the numbers, like I saw George Soros speak about 2 weeks ago, and he was looking at the extractive industry and talking about it and saying we're only counting the numbers that that are involved in what is being extracted at the moment as opposed to what has been improved. So I think that the unfortunate thing is that those numbers are kind of shaky, but again, does it really, does the 1.2 degrees actually permeate people's minds, and do they really understand the difference between like national policies on climate change and like when we're going to hit the 0.8%? So that's a problem. And so there is like the kind of, the issue of how you actually educate consumers on this issue, and then there's the issue of how you actually
Demonstration of Wirecast.
Washington, right? And national politics is really important, and they kind of go hand in hand. And the problem is that you never know what's going to be the tipping point. Is it going to be public pressure, or is it actually going to be leadership? And so, when I was working on climate change policy, it was the most frustrating thing in the world. And the inconvenient truth came in like a tsunami, and actually like really changed the perspective. Not completely, but really had a phenomenal impact on
A demonstration of Wirecast.
how they should be treating this issue. To like basically saying you can't ignore it. I know at the time, actually, I remember watching Question Time very early at like 2 in the morning, and as one does. And our environment minister and prime minister at the time, who were conservative, were mocking, Al Gore's attempts to try and bring this to the fore, only then to see this like international response that came. And it was really what compelled me, and I say this a lot, to get into content
This is a
and about
demonstration of
policy
Wirecast.
framework, because I just thought, wow, there's a real opportunity there. So, the focus is first, in my opinion, I think is first and foremost talking to a new generation of thinkers around these like core issues, and then actually permeating government, and I don't think that one can happen exclusively with the other. It's not, you're going to put all your eggs in one basket, you've got to do both. But there's a lot to be said. I actually spoke to participant media today to do all these great films. One of my favourite production company
This is a
did
demonstration
Truth,
of
and Jess
Wirecast.
Gold is a champion of that platform. But they've done Waiting for Superman, but Good Night, Good Luck, and Syriana, and Charlie Wills of War. But they said that the most effective campaigning that they do is when they actually take the film on the road and they actually get influencers, in the respective fields, whether it's a fracking film, they actually like play it in front of people, and that's been known, I think, politically to always have a huge impact. fun thing about my day job is the fact that I get to work this out, and I'm building a new division of Vice, and and it was a big leap for the company to actually decide to go and do this. They could sit very comfortably in the media sphere and produce objective journalism and not go, above and beyond into the advocacy space. But I think it's very difficult in this day and age to not kind of produce objective journalism. Like anyone that's working in the journalism space fundamentally has an opinion about these issues, and so that's what we're trying to do. And I've just said the climate change thing has been most probably my most difficult challenge, just because we want to come up with clear and consistent narratives, and we're actually setting KPIs against our work on an annual basis, or actually going to pick narratives, set KPIs, and work with partners to actually deliver on them. And so, what do they look like? Because just to talk about climate change now, I think is really ambiguous. Again, because of the contradictory information, because the enormity of the challenge of educating people on these issues. And so, kind of to your earlier point, in your approach, how do you do that effectively? And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about at the moment. And so we have mechanisms as part of Vice Impact, and I don't want to chirp on too much about the platform, although we're launching early next year, so I feel. Thinking about, we'll have tools on the platform that will actually help people take action and make donations. So we'll identify, who in the marketplace we really respect, how we're going to highlight their work. I think the most important thing about working with UN institutions actually is the fact that you guys are just an amazing data repository of information, and that doesn't really exist.
We're using it.
Excellent.
And so trying to bring that into the public for actually looking at many institutions and where their strengths lie and how we can actually gather that information and basically produce it in a way that's digestible for people to consume. And again, I'm kind of more concerned about talking to millennials and creators and converters. So actually really looking at that content and reproducing it in a way where someone can really understand the issues. But I just think in the context of the election, because I think that was the way that this conversation was framed, you can't discount the fact that people's knowledge around these issues is important. And if this had been an election that was all about climate change, it would have had a different effect on the outcome, not on potentially the whole outcome, but just in terms of youth participation and engagement on these issues. And I just can't fundamentally understand why that didn't happen. And so that's my big focus. Again, we're going to set KPIs and make commitments and really try to make a tangible impact in the space in terms of what we've set out to achieve, and we'll announce those commitments when we launch the platform. But again, I think that what's interesting, particularly in public forums too, is to try and identify where the missing links were. So that's what I'm thinking.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
Yale and George Mason, my alma mater, do studies on climate attitudes across the country and behavior annually, and pretty consistently they see majority percentages recognizing that climate change is happening, that we should do something about it. Then when you gauge their behavior, small percentages, minority, involved in reaching out to their elected officials, state, local, federal, or contacting the media. So when and don't present the climate science the way that we need it to. Okay, let's take some questions. Yes, if you could just identify yourself and then jump into the question. Let's take 3 questions, pass to the stage, and then take another 3, etc. Take here, there, and then I saw a hand back there. Yes, great.
Steve Roberts. I don't think there's an American, a voting American, who's not aware of the fact that the ice cap is melting faster, that the Great Barrier Reef is being destroyed, that high water tables are happening all over the place. And yet, they're still deniers. So they have statistics, they have facts, they have information, but they're not willing to accept it. So how do you change the
Demonstration of
Great question.
Wirecast.
Great, we'll take a second one back there. Thank you.
My question is about trade. So much of the, electorate was about trade, being hit on trade, and historically, when the EU tried to regulate emissions from airplanes, they didn't succeed. And I'm wondering if in Morocco there was conversations about this in terms of tools that the international community can use against the Trump
This is
administration.
a demonstration of
in the
Wirecast.
trade sphere to penalize or make them compliant.
Great, thank you for that. And last question over here.
I feel a bit more comfortable without a microphone. My question is regards to...
Well, I think we need the microphone for the live streaming.
Oh, okay. My question is in regards to media ownership.
Yeah.
Given two extremely large media conglomerates that are rapidly expanding, and as you mentioned, starting to produce close to 100% of their own content, I'm wondering how you feel about the dissemination of climate change news and also recommendations for alleviating the negative side effects as media ownership narrows across the board, both in radio, television, and mixed media.
Great. Thanks.
To your question, Steve, there's a scholar at Yale named Dan Kahan, and he's a very original thinker, very creative, and does research on what he calls cultural cognition. And he's shown that group identity matters more than fact. The creative intent that, like the behavioral researchers over the last 20 years have come to the conclusion that just that, like social identity matters, and like your social identity is more important to you, than if your friends are going to make fun of you for saying something, even if it's true, like all things being equal, I'm probably just going to avoid the friction, right? So the easiest shortcut is to just look up Dan Kahan at Yale.
This is a demonstration of
And
Wirecast.
actually, one thing I think he told me this about when Scott Walker was was still in the presidential race, and he was taking some strident denier positions that there was the timber industry in the north of the state, sort of came back to him and said, yeah, we know climate's not happening. We know that's all made up, except it's like things are really changing up here, so we got to deal with it. So like you're seeing this starting to see this bifurcated, mind space among people who need to maintain a political identity and like an empirical identity, I guess. I don't know what you call it. On trade, okay. I think that's still a gray area. We've seen a couple politicians, or one politician at least in France, call for trade sanctions if
This
the
is a
president-elect ends
demonstration
up
of Wirecast.
getting out of the Paris Treaty. But we also saw calls from the UN and other countries saying, no, we're not going to threaten this yet. And so that's a gray area. It's easy to forget that nothing has actually happened yet. Trump hasn't actually done anything yet, and once he does do something, one way or another, then the consequences become more serious. And finally, about media.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
It's interesting, like most of the time, I think I probably share your perspective of we need newspapers in every town so that there's somebody in every city in America, in every congressional district, looking down that silo in Congress and trying to figure out what's going on. And never mind the bigger issue that, it's hard to keep a community together if your people aren't
This
reading
is a
the same
demonstration
newspaper.
of Wirecast.
It's literally at the school of nationalism. Check out, it's an old book at this point, but Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson. His theory of nationalism is a nation of people is a group of people who you'll never meet, but you all read the same newspapers. So, but on the other hand, you got to give credit to the fact there is more good journalism and direct accessing information today than there has ever been, even imagined. So I
This is a
do take a lot
demonstration
of
of Wirecast.
What's the word I'm looking for here? Well, let's not go crazy. I use that optimism. Like today I needed tornado data from for the U.S. For the last like 30 years, and I had it in like 17 seconds, and like it's just not normal. So there is a lot of good going on there. Like change isn't all bad, just because it's change.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
Yeah, I guess just to throw a few remarks. When you look at the exit polls, like the unfortunate thing is that just people want to change over economic security. So rationality, unfortunately, doesn't really necessarily play into people's like choices. And people are fundamentally self-interested, so they're also thinking about the bottom line versus like these big policies. You know, this is a fight we have on all fronts on a constant basis. And so, you know, while we're concerned about it, doesn't actually motivate us really thinking about it, we have to change our personal habits, no, you know, and so it is up to, you know, the organisations that are dedicated to this issue to do something about it. And I think to kind of your point, you know, when you look from media organisation to organisation and politician to politician, you know, it just depends on their opinions, you know, and so then that permeates the organisation, their practices, and what they're allowed to actually produce, you know, and most media organisations are very top-heavy in terms of their editorial agenda. Thankfully, don't. It's not true. And so that's really important as well. And interestingly enough, like I did a lot of analysis on the issues that our audience cared about when I started Advice and looked at the content that ran across the network. And even though we know that young people care about, you know, climate change as an issue, it didn't necessarily reflect on the numbers that came out of the analysis that I did. And so therefore, if I was like, well, it depends on what our audience cares about, you know, therefore we should focus on these issues. I'm actually sick of being no, you know, like that doesn't mean that we can ban climate change just because the numbers haven't been there, and we need to push even harder. So, and our CEO feels the same way. You know, he's really turned his attention to climate change in a meaningful way. So therefore, it gives me the mandate to produce the kind of content on the issue and have the company invested in it. So, and then I think obviously the trade conversation. I just think, you know, the China equation is something that should be discounted here, and just markets. You know, I think, you know, Trump can say what he wants to say, but at the end of the day, there are markets that play into your earlier remarks about the fact that states are at play too. You know, there is a bigger force, you know, in motion here than Trump, fortunately. So, and so that has to guide the marketplace. So while everyone's freaking out, I'm less concerned about it, because it is really difficult, even in the broken mechanism that is Washington at the moment,
This is a demonstration
to move these
of
legal things
Wirecast.
and dismantle institutions like the EPA. So I'm not too concerned about the fact that he's going to be a wrecking ball in this space. And as I said, America's been on this trajectory for quite some time now, so it's just going to be business as usual.
Yeah. I looked at that just quickly, like particularly when it comes to like solar and wind energy. It's just like, and I like the death of coal is like there's no war on coal necessarily unless it's being conducted by natural gas. So yeah, the market's really important, and in general, we see time and again that Washington can be, just a paper shredder for executive authority.
I found out last night even that there was I think it was the Delhi Clean Air Act that's just been instituted, and now all of a sudden it's having this kind of domino effect across India as one state, elects to do something that it moves forward just because of the necessity for it,
Right.
And so, that's not a national policy, that's actually a state policy. So I think market forces and just honestly the exciting kind of wins that are happening in the renewable space. I was at the Tesla presentation in LA a couple of weeks ago, seeing their new solar tiles. Very impressive. They took over Wisteria Lane in Universal Studios, and then they put solar panels and their battery home packs in all the houses, and every cool Tesla cars, which I was impressed by. And there's a company called Swell who are now like the largest distributor of home battery packs, which is kind of like a solar solution with also like a home battery pack. And they sold 3,000 units to Orange County about 4 weeks ago, and as a consequence, Orange County turned down their plans for $1 billion power plant from selling 3,000 units. So you're starting to see stories like that are going to really have a massive knock-on effect across our country. And again, it's those types of innovations and market forces that are really going to hopefully be the driving force for this. And I think that's part of our job too, is to tell those types of stories rather than just be on this ridiculous news cycle of like, we need to get out of trouble.
Yeah. I'm going to do a quick round on these 3 questions too, because these are good ones. So I live at the Hudson River in a town called Peekskill, and while my neighbors aren't heavily engaged on the UN front or on the climate change writ large macro policy front, they are mobilizing pretty actively around security, economic, and health impacts of local fossil fuels. And I'll give a couple examples. The pipeline that's coming through is a security issue for them, and they're mobilizing with protests weekly. The waste to energy plant has particulates coming out, and the city council is worried about that because they don't want to breathe it in. We got an F in the latest Lung Association ranking Westchester County. And Sustainable Westchester and opportunities with community choice aggregation, they're moving forward with that because they see the economic potential around this whole thing. So they're mobilized around security, economic, and health impacts in a way that they aren't mobilized at the national or international level around the climate conversation. So we're always trying to think about creative ways to get people, and it's usually local, and it's usually security, economic, or health-based. On trade, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, so many of my climate comrades aren't conversant on TPP or TTIP. Transatlantic or Trans-Pacific trade conversation should be, and it makes the progressive trade activists and advocates in DC mad that there's not more collaboration. It's just a good example of the silos that exist between the kind of SDG community, sustainable development community, the climate community, the trade community, the health community. That's slow, those gaps are slowly closing, but not fast enough. And on your media conglomerate, my grad students here will quickly note my push to them often, weekly, about putting our voices out there, because there are some problematic trends, as you've identified, that have been going on for years. And it is up to us, too, to arrest that trend a little bit with our own input. And to Eric's point, focus on community papers. When I worked for Congressman Honda, I cared less about the national rags than I did about the local rags, because that's what people were reading. And there is some independence there that still exists, but it is up to us to enter that conversation, be a part of it. A couple more questions. Let's take another 3. Yes? Oh, sorry, we're going to get a microphone. And if you just identify yourself, too.
I'm Harriet Resnick. The issues we're talking about are so
This is a demonstration
huge
of Wirecast.
that they can overwhelm people and frustrate them and just make them feel like throwing up their hands. So how can you make individual action possible, feasible for people so that they can contribute themselves towards mitigating climate change or preventing climate change?
Great, thank you. Some more questions?
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
Quick question on the role of media, kind of again going back to the point. Seems to me that the media has experienced this failure to influence or reflection. I think 95% probably of media outlets endorsed Clinton, and of course people voted the other way. I think when we're talking about the topic, I think you mentioned, okay, people know, but they are cognitively
This is a
dissonant, or
demonstration
they are
of
attached to their
Wirecast.
social norms. To me, that's not really a satisfactory answer. What's the way the media can reach out better, convince people better? You also mentioned that you're going in the direction of more partisan or more bias maybe in your coverage, which seems to be the exact wrong way to do it, because people don't trust the media, apparently. So how can the media really question themselves and push this forward?
This
A lot of
is a
questions in there.
demonstration
Good, thank
of
you.
Wirecast.
Okay, one more question? Yes. Encourage my grad students to.
Hi, I'd like to.
Sorry, can you just identify yourself?
My name is Juliana. I just graduated from the program here.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I'd like to know your take on Paris, because I mean, you've already mentioned that it's not a very comprehensive comprehensive agreement. Local governments are already threatening it.
Of Wirecast.
Trump election here, or I'm from Brazil. In Brazil, we had the impeachment, and the new president is already saying, "Oh, these goals are intended. We are not very committed. It will depend if we receive money or not." And many African countries are already talking about receiving money from abroad as well. So, I mean, if it was already not a very good agreement, and people are already threatening it to go forward.
Demonstration
What
of
will happen?
Wirecast.
What is
Big question.
Yeah.
Good. Great, thank you. Take any of those? Individual action, media influence.
Sure.
Paris?
So people who follow this space probably know the name David Roberts, who's a writer for Vox.com. He was at Chris for a long time, and so he wrote a piece a year or 2 or 5 years ago, I can't keep track anymore, called "Everybody Needs Their Own Climate Thing." So if you just Google like David Roberts climate thing, like this column will probably come up. And so what he says in that is, the headline doesn't leave much to the imagination. Like, start with what you're interested in, or where you live. And if you follow your own interests, we're talking about the climate here, of the Earth. So, like, pretty soon, either directly or indirectly, you're going to be able to layer in or see opportunities
Demonstration of Wirecast.
for work on climate change because they're there. Whether you're locally active and in touch with your, member of Congress, or there's a big sandwich chain across the street from you, and like the sandwich chain most likely has a position on climate change. So it's everywhere, and as soon as you start scratching the surface, guided by your own interests,
This is
may
a
find
demonstration
something.
of Wirecast.
Or just find an organization to attach yourself to, find an organization that you like. Okay, God, there were like 10 questions there. The only one I remember is, what can you do more to like doubt yourself? And I'm like, oh man, if I doubted myself anymore, like I'd never publish anything. Like it's bad enough. I could actually use a cue.
Well, you had a couple questions about
Right.
media going forward and whether or not to be subjective, and that's maybe
This
less for
is
you
a
and more for
demonstration
that,
of
trust,
Wirecast.
where people are at in their relationship with media, I think
Yeah.
is interesting going forward.
This actually goes, maybe this is my climate thing, so I got in a lot of trouble with the meteorology community a few months ago. And I was just Twitter bashed for days. And one thing I do when that happens is I just call people. And so when you're like in a Twitter storm against somebody and
This is a
like they call you,
demonstration of
you're like,
Wirecast.
oh, this is like a person, and like they have to deal with you because you're on their phone.
Conversations.
Or even like with any article I write generates a number of really nasty emails, often in all caps. And I just wrote back and say, hey man, don't take my word for it. This is what I'm reading, Don't take my word for it, just read it yourself, and like engagement works. Even on the,
This
on
is a
my level.
demonstration of Wirecast.
It's just sort of, again, fact checking, but people are often surprised me with how rational they are underneath their irrational anger.
Can I just add to that, relevant to your question? So Eric did a call for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which is a consortium of a network of mayors globally. And he did a call to talk about what he needs as a reporter, what he likes from, in this
This is a
example, mayors,
demonstration
how
of
they should reach out to him.
Wirecast.
And one of the two things he said that stuck with me, one was things have to be surprising because he's not reading press releases anymore. And so the mayor needs to step up the mayor's engagement on this issue and do surprising things. We have a mayor in this town who probably isn't doing all he could. I'm being very diplomatic here in terms of his leadership on this issue. He could do so much more. But the second thing Eric said was relationships, and having the relationship, your point about picking up the phone. A lot of people don't have a relationship with a reporter, with an editor, with a producer.
This is
They're
a
very easy to
demonstration of
establish. I'm amazed
Wirecast.
that these two came here tonight based on our friendship, which is awesome. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for being willing to do that. But there are relationships to be formed, and they're often not. And that helps build trust where trust is sorely needed, and it's needed in the media space. And it creates a community of accountability too, so that Eric is talking with people around him, which he clearly prioritizes.
And the last question was about
Paris.
Yeah.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
It's it's a classic example of the best possible thing not necessarily being good, right? And to take a long-term view, in Paris, nobody, the solar boom hadn't happened yet. Solar is cost like a tenth of what it did in 2009. Same with wind.
This
The
is a
U.S. turns out has more
demonstration
natural
of
gas than anyone
Wirecast.
else in the world. No one thought any of these things were going to happen, and then they did, and then they happened without a carbon price. So what does that mean? Does that mean we get good things without a carbon price, or does it mean if we double down and have a carbon price, things will happen that much faster? And so keep those in mind, and then there was what's called the pause, right? There was there was a plateau of temperatures for about 10
This is a
years in there.
demonstration
I think
of
they sort of
Wirecast.
understand it now that there was this multi-decadal oscillation in the Pacific that sort of coincided with that. That's one leading explanation. But so what I just listed, we basically have gotten 4 or 5 mulligans on climate change in the last 10 or 15 years. So, is Paris great? Well, if you like champagne, yeah, it's great. Is it
This
a
is a
legal
demonstration of
mechanism by
Wirecast.
which people will get in trouble if they don't, do it? No, even though we all will, right?
So who have you guys seen the new Netflix series called The Crown?
I've heard it's excellent.
It's really good, by the way. So during my Thanksgiving shutdown, where I literally didn't read my emails for yesterday under duress, managed to start this very consuming series. And just to your point, made me think of, I thought of it
This
just
is a
because you were
demonstration
talking about
of
angry,
Wirecast.
meteorologists, basically. There's a scene in it from 1942 where the Great Haze went over England, and these meteorologists, someone comes off the roof after taking the reading and runs downstairs and throws the paper in, her boss's hand, and he then, runs to the next door and passes it to his boss, who then passes it to his boss, who passes it to his boss, and passes it to his boss, and then they write to the Prime Minister, and they said, write this urgent letter, not that he's going to read it, right?
This
And
is a
that 3-day
demonstration
haze,
of
they
Wirecast.
say now, in retrospect, took 12,000 lives, right? Which is just, obviously because of all the coal power plants there, it had a huge, it had a huge effect. It was this huge haze that ran over London for 3 straight days. So that's kind of, that's when it affects people. People wake up and start thinking about these things as what happened in Delhi with the Clean Air Act, which just happened. So, and I think that the
This
activism
is a
in the space
demonstration
is
of
where everyone, I
Wirecast.
think, has a role to play in this. All understand that you just can't be speaking about climate change. Open Purpose yesterday, which is an amazing organisation that I have enormous amount of respect for. You're a great advocacy organisation that basically create movements on different social issues. And they were just their great challenge at the moment is coming up international campaigns that don't really use the tag climate change. So because you try again to go
This
back.
is a
to
demonstration of
Wirecast.
Wirecast.
And in a lot of my advocacy work, that keeps on coming to the fore, which is how do you engage people on an emotional, personal level, as opposed to talking about the great big issue of climate change. And so, and again, that's why I don't have even after 6 months of analysis across all these big key issues, I'm constantly trying to find that access point where I feel whatever we apply ourselves to will hit that note of like really, people getting emotionally sucked into whatever
This
we're
is a
doing.
demonstration
And
of
I think
Wirecast.
to your question about media, the media, as I said, is a. Oh no, we were talking about Paris, sorry, but well, I think the Paris Agreement, again, as we know, is voluntary. But I went to an amazing roundtable on climate change, which was the far religious right, and so it was far right Christian organisations that all had come together for this like private roundtable.
This is a
And their
demonstration of
consensus around the
Wirecast.
table was that, it's not that the right don't believe in climate change, it's just that all the special interest groups in Washington, it comes at a cost applying themselves to climate change, and so they were like, you need to come up with, a carbon tax, sure, but a way to kind of compensate those Republican members who are actually going to, be creating sacrifices by actually moving across the line on this issue. And so special interests play a hand in that. So I think my point is just that there
This is a
is no one
demonstration
solution
of
to this.
Wirecast.
And, obviously the media has an important role to play in it, and content in general. But I think that the creation of putting all of these, all of these elements together, or not-for-profit organisations, new industries, trade groups that are forcing a hand on so many of these issues. It's a constant, model of sorts that you need to pay
This is
attention
a demonstration
to
of
in order to
Wirecast.
implement these things. So that's why it really does make it's such an important effort when you think about everyone that's out there kind of championing this issue.
I'm going to do a quick round on these 3 questions before we close, because your question was somewhat close to his. And again, for my comrades in Peekskill, from a security standpoint, they're mobilizing around a high compression gas pipeline that's right beside a nuclear power plant that's failing. And for them, it's a security issue because it's run by a school and their kids are in school and they're worried about a gas explosion, taking out the nuclear power plant, taking out New York City. They're framing that locally through a security frame, or the economic opportunity with solar panels, or the health issue with particulates coming out of waste energy. But my mom is a good example of what you're describing, in that when she thinks about climate science, she is overwhelmed and debilitated and paralyzed in that moment. It doesn't feel like she can do anything. For years, I was encouraging her to go organic and go local and change her fridge. And she finally told me to shut up, and she's like, Michael, I don't enjoy our conversations. Please stop talking to me about this. And so I did. And then a year or 2 later, they were at the doctor, both my mom and her husband, and the doctor was like, you have to get off meat for these reasons. And so they actually went organic and green, not for me or for my reasons, but for health reasons. And for them, it was very personal. And now their carbon footprint around their food is a lot lighter than it was for health reasons, not for environmental reasons. To your media point, I would love for you, next time you see a well-written article that you like, to email that reporter.
This is a
and tell them
demonstration of
that you liked it
Wirecast.
and it was well-written. I follow a lot of my friends on Twitter, and I will often see, like Amy Harder tweeted one time, she writes at the Wall Street Journal, she was in Marrakesh as well, that she just issued a 1,000-word response to a hater who emailed her being like, what's this dribble that you're writing? And she's actually really in a really interesting position talking about climate change within the Wall Street Journal. So people are getting a lot of hate mail, to Eric's point, in terms of all cap stuff. They're getting a lot of that. And so if you counter that with, hey, really love what you're doing,
This is a
I think we value
demonstration
that.
of
I can't speak
Wirecast.
to them here, but I've heard reporters respond positively to my positive response to their pieces. And lastly, on Paris. So we're supposed to peak emissions before 2050 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2100. And I'm going to give a quick anecdote on that. So I have a colleague, I won't name her name in case she's watching this, but we were having a conversation around vegetarianism. And she is not a vegetarian. I have been a vegetarian for 20 years, and I do it for mostly environmental sustainable issues. I killed animals before I grew up on a farm.
Wirecast.
I'm okay with killing, though, sorry. I'm okay with killing a chicken, though I think everyone who eats meat should have to kill their animal. But she wasn't vegetarian because she felt, my colleague, that it was up to the feds, it was up to policy, national or international, national in this case, to create the parameters for diet for ag, and anyone who's tracking USDA and the big animal industry that's impacting USDA's decision
This is a
making
demonstration
and
of
parameters for national
Wirecast.
diet knows that we can't leave it up to the USDA to make this decision. So how do we as a world peak emissions before 2050 and achieve carbon neutrality? I mean, it's really up to us. It's up to our cities. It's up to our mayors and our governors. But the culpability of our individual action is paramount. We can't keep hoping. My colleague is assuming that someday federal policy will weigh in on food the right way to achieve sustainability and carbon neutrality. I don't see it happening.
This
And
is
so
a
it's really up to
demonstration
us
of
to make those
Wirecast.
decisions collectively now, so we can move that out. Before we thank them, I highly encourage you to Google Eric Roston carbon clock. That's where he gets into the Keating curve, like I mentioned, Bloomberg. It's fascinating. There's a couple visual slides you can look at. And then what's responsible, may not be getting the title right, but what's responsible for greenhouse gas emissions?
What's really warming the world?
What's really warming the world? Better. What's really warming the world? Google that, because he ticks through all the potential, who's culpable, deforestation, etc. Great visuals to use. Check out Katherine Keating's own writing for Vice. She's been writing on women of late, but also writes for Huffington Post and World Post, doing some great work on other issues not mentioned tonight, but they're both incredible voices out there. Help me thank them for their time. And I assume we are closed. Thank you for coming.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.